So section 7, we had this question: what ideas are associated with Fukuzawa Yukichi? Why were they so important? And Fukuzawa Yukichi was this guy who had studied Dutch and later English. He was Japanese, right? And he had been very curious about the outside world when Japan was still closed. So he studied Dutch, because remember, the Dutch were allowed to hang around in Japan on this little island. And then later on, when Japan opened, he learned English, because he learned, Britain and the United States were two of the most important countries. So I said, well, if I know English, I can understand those two countries in terms of power. And he had this question: why was the West so powerful? Why is it just a few Western ships commanded by Matthew Perry? Why can they just show up in Japan and force us to open our doors, right? What made them so darn strong? And we've talked about some answers people gave, right? Some people just said, well, because white people are just biologically superior. And that's not a good answer from his perspective, because you can't change your biology. So he said, it can't be race, and if it is race, there's nothing we can do about it. Well, maybe it's religion. That was something people said, right? What are the most powerful countries? They're Christian. And the most powerful of the powerful countries were primarily Protestant Christian. And he didn't accept that idea either. What he did, though, was study. He studied, for example, British and American history. And especially with British history, he realized they once were as we are now. So, for example, Americans and British people criticized Japan because they did things like execute prisoners by cutting off their heads and then putting their heads on display. And they said, oh, that's barbaric, that's uncivilized. How can you Japanese people do that? And then by studying British history, Fukuzawa Yukichi was like, oh, wait a second, they did that too for a long time. And then they changed, and they don't do it anymore. So they were still Christian and they did this. They were still white and they did this. But something changed, and they stopped doing these things. Once they were weak, like we were weak, but something changed. Their race and their religion stayed the same. What changed? Well, what changed was they discovered the principles of civilization. And from his perspective, civilization basically, for our purposes, what he means is the Western people discovered those revolutions, right? The scientific, industrial, economic, and political, right? They discovered the way that the world works. It's not that there's such a thing as Western civilization. It's just the people in the West figured out these principles first. If we Japanese people adopt them, we can become powerful just like the Westerners. Right, so we can imitate the Westerners in terms of commerce, industry, and science, because those are just natural laws that we can follow that govern that. But we can keep our art, music, and religion and stay Japanese. So adopting the 4 revolutions we've been talking about doesn't make us not be Japanese anymore. We can stay Japanese while becoming modern. And that's why he's so smart. And that's why he's so important. He figures out how Japan can stay can stay Japanese while becoming modern. Why were the Japanese new elite so important for Japan's modernization? And as I answer that, I'll also deal with this question: what radical reforms did the Japanese government undertake? So, first of all, the samurai, this group of samurai overthrow the Tokugawa government and restore the emperor to power. Those samurai were radical nationalists. Their major goal was to do whatever it took to make Japan a powerful country, which meant adopting civilization, that is, the 4 revolutions. But what's key about this, those samurai who led the restoration and who took power with the rise of the emperor were low-ranking or middle samurai. And in the old system, the Tokugawa system that they overthrew, they were nothing. Even though they were samurai, they were the poorer samurai. And remember, that Tokugawa system was hereditary. If you're born a poor samurai, you're always a poor samurai. If you're born a rich samurai, you're always a rich samurai. It's hereditary, not just simply between the classes, but even within the samurai class. So these guys who took power did not like the old system. So they were willing to completely change it. They were losers under the old system. The old system said, under the Tokugawa, said, you guys are middle, low samurai, you're poor samurai, you're nothing. Well, you're willing to get rid of a system that says that you're nothing. Right? So they were quite happy to reform the old system and to undertake radical reform. That's why they're different from the elites in like the Qing dynasty. Remember, the Qing dynasty elites didn't want to get rid of Confucianism because that's where their power came from. Right? They didn't want to adopt science because that would mean questioning Confucianism, so they don't want to do that. So China has a hard time reforming. Here in Japan, the people who take power don't win under the old system, so they're willing to change it and bring in radical reforms. What kind of radical reforms do they bring in? Like I said, they're very radical. They build a centralized state with a constitution and democracy. Right? That's really radical. Not even Russia had this at this time period. But Japan looked and said, well, United States, Britain, France, Germany, they're all really powerful countries, and they all have those things. So we need to have them too. One thing that I find particularly striking, the Japanese Constitution granted religious freedom. Right? Remember earlier in the 1910s and 20s, we talked about how people are restricting religion. Japan gives religious freedom. That's how much it emphasizes democracy and constitutional law. They will institute compulsory education, not simply for boys, but also girls. Right? And they do this at the same time. When they make a law that says boys have to go to school for 4 years, girls also have to go to school for 4 years because they need an educated population to serve in the industrial economy and conscript army. You can't run a factory, or you can't work in a factory or be a good soldier if you can't read and write. This government will also support industrialization. Right? Japan doesn't have the necessary requirements to have the industrialization on its own, but the government realizes that's important, and so it will invest in industry, help build it up to get it started, because they realize, and this is an ancient Chinese saying, rich country, strong army. If we want Japan to have a powerful army, to be a strong and independent nation, we need a strong economy to be the foundation. And because of these radical reforms, that's why Japan, even though it's smaller than China, even though it was, in some ways it had an inferior navy to China, it will actually win in the Sino-Japanese War. What was the significance of the Trans-Siberian Railway? How did the Russo-Japanese War begin? Why did Japan defeat Russia in that war? What is the historical significance of Japan's victory? So the Trans-Siberian Railway, first of all, it is a Russian railway. The Russians are building a railway across Siberia that would connect European Russia with the Russian Empire in the east. Right? So the Russians are building an empire that will allow them to project power to bring settlers, goods, and soldiers from European Russia into the east. Right? And that would allow them to expand their power even further. They're expanding their power into Manchuria. That would allow them to threaten Korea, which would allow them to threaten Japan. So the Japanese do not like this. This makes them very, very nervous. So Japan will attempt to convince Russia to cease this expansion. Japan will say, you're threatening our security. This is not a good thing. Please back off. The Russians do not take them seriously. The Russian Tsar will actually refer to the Japanese as monkeys in his letter, which is a sign you're not taking someone seriously. The Japanese feel backed into a corner. Even though Russia is much larger and more powerful than Japan, the Japanese realize that they just don't do anything. Eventually, Russia will just come in and take over. So the Japanese decide, let's roll the dice, and they launch a surprise attack against the Russians at the city of Port Arthur. As an aside, surprise attacks were not illegal in this time period. You did not have to declare war before attacking someone in this time period. When Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor, though, it was illegal. But in this time period, not illegal. Now, Japan, shockingly enough, will win this war. In part because of Russian problems. The Japanese were right to go ahead and attack Russia because they had not actually completed the railway. Right? They attacked the Russians before they could complete the railway. It was very hard for Russia to bring all of its soldiers and supplies all the way from Europe to Asia. Right? So that was one key reason. The Russians had a hard time supplying their troops and bringing in more troops. In addition, because Japan had undertaken radical reform and the Western revolutions, it had built a strong enough economy and army that was able to stand up to the Russians in a fair fight. Right? While it started with a surprise attack, it was a surprise naval attack. The Russian army and the Russian Navy actually fought, stand-up fights, and the Japanese army won. Right? Because they had undertaken these revolutions. And the significance in part, there's kind of three things that are significant. This shows the problem in racial thinking. Right? All these people, Europeans and Americans are like, the Russians are white, they're European, they will easily defeat the Japanese. Nope, Japanese do just fine, they win this war. So this shows that if you successfully adopt civilization, the revolutions, you can win. Right? This gave hope to a lot of people. For example, a lot of Chinese people were so excited that Japan won this war, even though Japan had just defeated China, because they said, aha, this means we too, like the Japanese, can become modern. This also allows Japan to dominate Korea. It will annex Korea in 1910, and this will set the stage for Japan's expansion into Manchuria, which will eventually lead to its invasion of China and World War II.